They just assume that because people lived in before us that they were stupid. So they keep throwing this argument in our faces these days, separating spirituality and separating religion and separating science. And they say if it's not scientific, if it's not science, then it's just BS and it's people's imagination and dumb people in the past. And that there's a relentless and a concerted effort to remove the stories of giants from history, from any kind of teaching.
The scale is difficult because, it's very hard to comprehend a being of that kind of size. I remember one of my favorite stories that I tell is that you and I are driving to Nelspruit by the back road, and you said, I've always been curious about this stone over here on the side. And there was kind of lumpy shaped stone. And you said, let's stop and check, see if we can, what is that? It's always, called my attention. And that, the answer that I got was that was a bit of stomach lining of a giant. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this series of talks with my good friend Michael Tellinger on the topic of giants,
where we continue our discussion on all things amazing to do with stone circles, ancient ruins, civilizations in Southern Africa. And in this series, we'll be talking about giants.
To keep us somewhat following a path, I've made a little, so if I look over here, it's because I'm checking our notes to see how we wander, because we'll wander.
Yeah, this is not live television. This is live, raw brainstorming and sharing of information.
Yeah.
This is not edited, beautifully pre-planned tracking shots and lighting. This is live, real as it gets, as real as it can get, coming straight from our brain to the ears of those who want to listen.
Excellent. There's a beautiful phrase in indigenous Australian language called yarning, and we're having a bit of a yarn.
Yes.
Having a bit of a yarn about all things giant. So I thought we should start with kind of where, just on your side of things, where your brain and focus started to move to the giant thing. Was it the whole mud fossil? Was that with the beginning for you?
No, it was long before that. The mud fossils was the recognition and the landing for me. The landing, the grounding, the realization that this is real. This is as real as it could possibly get. Because suddenly I'm standing in front of small body parts of large giants, like, a finger that shows us that this giant was 70 meters tall, to bones in the field that suggest these giants were 300 meters tall, to the giant footprint that many have seen, millions have seen around the world. That giant would have been about 10 or 12 meters tall. All different shapes and sizes of giants. But prior to that, I was obviously already intrigued and interested in the subject of giants, seeing the historic evidence of giants all over the world, various books that were published about it. And there's actually a great book, if for those interested, my good friend Hugh Newman and his partner, Jim Vieira, they published this book called Giants on Record. It's a phenomenal copy. I was lucky enough to be at Contact in the Desert and got this copy from Hugh 2 years ago. It's a great compilation of all the recordings, all the history of giants, newspaper articles, the Smithsonian's involvement in removing the giants and so forth. So anyone interested in having a glossary or like a dictionary, a record of all the historic evidence of giants, great book to get on that subject. So I was obviously interested in the giant subject a long time ago, studying ancient civilizations and the Bible and so forth. It's just always, giants are constantly a subject that comes up over and over and over again. And for people that study the Bible, that's a great place of departure. From Goliath and David and Goliath's story. This was a guy that was obviously, at least twice the size, possibly more, than David. We have the story of the Anuna or the Anunnaki from the Sumerian tablets, the giants. We have the many more biblical stories of the Anak and the Anakim, the giants. Then in Leviticus, we read about the lands where the giants were so large, we looked like locusts by their side. I mean, that is not a small individual. Let me continue with the Bible. Obviously, then in the rabbinical, the Hebrew Bible, the rabbinical part of the Bible, they talk about the Gibberim, the Zamzumim, the Emim, the Rephaim, all these different gigantic beings, groups of beings that lived in ancient times. And these are scholars of ancient times, people that recorded history. But unfortunately, what has happened is, as you know, and many people that will watch this video will know, but there might be some people that are new to this information. There is a relentless effort by mainstream academia to separate sort of religious and oral tradition from science, scientific evidence. So they say if it's not scientific, if it's not science, then it's just bullshit, and it's just people in ancient times who are stupid and ignorant. They couldn't distinguish a giant from somebody standing on, climbing a tree. They make stupid comparisons like that people didn't know the difference between lightning and a flying ship in the sky. They just assume that because people lived in before us that they were stupid. So they keep throwing this argument in our faces these days, separating spirituality and separating religion and separating science. And they say if it's not scientific, if it's not science, then it's just BS and it's people's imagination and dumb people in the past. And that there's a relentless and a concerted effort to remove the stories of giants from history, from any kind of teaching. And this is what this book, Giants on Record, goes into very well. And obviously I came across that many, many years ago, that there's this relentless effort, especially by the Smithsonian, that seems to have been the spearhead to remove giants from history. For example, what happened with the mounds in Ohio, the giants that were buried, the Native Americans that talk about the giants that lived in that part of the world in North America, and the giants were buried and their skeletons and their remains lie under the mounds of Ohio. Several of those mounds were excavated, we know, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that evidence of those giants was rapidly removed. So there's just evidence of giants all over the place throughout all human history. And that is where my interest was. And then obviously when I stumbled upon the physical evidence that I held in my hands that is now in the Stone Circle Museum, and the large pieces that are too big to bring there lie scattered in the mountains around us, as you very well know, that we've gone to see, that's when I realized this is real. And when you start seeing claw marks and teeth marks, as you know, you were with us when we discovered the claw marks and the teeth marks. You were there in January 2018 when we realized we're dealing with fossils. That's a big aha moment. And then you start recognizing the different petrified body parts and the different types of fossils of humanoids and different creatures and reptilians and dinosaurs and humanoid giants that lie scattered across the mountains here in South Africa. And then you realize it's not just here, it's all over the world. And it just gets weirder and weirder. And you realize how little we know about our human history, how little we know about our origins, what really went down on this earth, and how well it's been hidden and removed from our psyche, removed from our history books. It's spectacular.
Yeah. Well, I remember when we first met each other, and we were at Adam's Calendar, and I was standing next to you, and this really tall spirit was standing next to me. And, it was about 8-ish feet tall. I mean, we, later as we chatted with that nurse character, that was an Anunnaki spirit, but again, really tall. So then when you see something like, when on that trip, when we went off to the giant's footprint, and it was beginning for me to sort of go, all right. So part of my journey with this topic was to be encountering these giants. And I think one of the things I love about this path of shamanism for me is that every once in a while, there's something that I come in contact with that I have to just shake my head and go, okay, all right, sure, why not? Okay, let's go. All right, I'm talking to a tree. Okay, that's fine. I can do that. Okay, I'm talking to a giant. Okay, sure. I'm talking to an alien. Okay, all right, sure. So it's just, why not? So I had to go through a whole phase of, okay, why not? And I remember in 2018 that you gave me we got a piece of a stone that was just really weird looking. It didn't look like a rock. It looked like a bone. And, you said, I wonder what this is. And it was before we really started collecting. And so I went and sat on the deck and tried to contact the energy of that particular stone. And I just looked back at my notes before our chat, and the being that I got in contact with, it was a vertebra from a tail. And it said that some giants had tails. Not all giants were without tails. And that this was about a quarter of a vertebra of a tail. And I was like, oh my God, okay, sure, right. Okay, here we go. So that's my first memories of being with you and looking at these rocks and going, okay, what?
Yeah. I want to come back a little bit to the Bible, because many people are not really aware of what the Bible is, where it comes from, who put this thing that we call the Bible together. And it's important for people to understand that the Bible is a Roman Empire creation.
Yeah.
Right? Constantine is ultimately the guy, Emperor Constantine, in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea. That's where it was really decided what the books of the Bible are going to be, what they're going to put together into what is, in essence, today's Bible. And that's when they excluded a lot of other books. So the Bible is really a compilation of individual prophets, and people of ancient times that told stories and had special interesting components of the story of Jesus and before the creation of humanity and so forth. So there are many books that could have been in the Bible that are not in the Bible. They're called the apocryphal books, right? And there are dozens and dozens of these books. And the book of Enoch is just one of them. Book of Enoch is becoming, and has become over the last 20 years probably, one of the most talked about, maybe it's not even 20 years, has become one of the most talked about and interesting books, because Enoch is an interesting biblical character. So we know about Enoch. We read about him in the Bible and how Enoch walked with God and then he disappeared. And God took him up to heaven, and he never came back. And I think that's what happened with Enoch. And keep in mind that Enoch was the father of Noah, right? So now we got a very interesting story about Enoch telling us about the world, the land, what was happening, and the giants, and how big these giants were. And Enoch tells us very clearly, and I tried to find recently, I wanted to see for myself, because I have not read the entire book of Enoch. I've read snippets of it. So I went and I looked through the entire book of Enoch, and I looked where he refers to the giants. And I think it was on page 60, around page 60, where he starts to talk about the giants that lived in these lands. And he describes them as 3,000 ells tall. Now, there's a big debate as what is an ell, because that was the unit of measure that was used in those days. And there was a unit of measure because it was a measure that everybody could more or less get it right. An ell was from your fingertips to the bottom of your elbow. So this is an ell, right? And if you look at that, that's about half a meter. So about 50 centimeters. So if you put two of those together, if you put your arms, that's 1 meter. So if something is 3,000 ells, that would be 1,500 meters. So that's 1.5 kilometer tall giants. That's how big these individuals were. And we have to take this seriously. We can't say that Enoch was an idiot. He was a stupid guy. He didn't understand what a giant was. He was confusing giants with mountains. That's how our scientists, our academics today always argue against this ancient knowledge, this oral tradition, this oral history, and often written history. Even if it's written down, they still think it's a bunch of garbage because these people are stupid. They can't have been smart enough because giants don't exist, so they must have imagined it. And that's always the argument that they use, these so-called very clever people at our universities and the scholars that write our history books. And that's just a great, it's not just a shame, it's a crime. It's a crime against humanity that we are paying our children, we're paying huge amounts of money to send our children to university and to school to learn the garbage that these guys put into the history books and claim to be, the most advanced knowledge and research knowledge that we have. While in essence, it's actually a very sterilized and a very cunningly and calculatingly edited version of not only history and what happened to the world and to humanity in the past, but that can be extrapolated to all the subjects that we learn at school and at university, from biology to genetics, to science, to physics, mathematics. Mathematics is an interesting one. That's a little bit more complicated, but definitely physics and science and the laws of nature and so forth, and obviously biology as well. And history is the big one, and astronomy. Oh my God, astronomy that's another huge one where a lot of information has been sterilized, has been edited, is censored, and we only get told a little bit of what's really going on, what space is, and so forth. But now I'm digressing a bit. Let's come back to giants, because I just wanted to indicate and illustrate that the deception regarding our history that includes giants is extrapolated across all the subjects and areas of education.
Yeah. Well, scale has been a challenge, because as we make contact and you and I travel these places and I, am able to contact them, the scale is difficult because, it's very hard to comprehend a being of that kind of size. I remember one of my favorite stories that I tell is that you and I are driving to Nelspruit by the back road, and you said, I've always been curious about this stone over here on the side. And there was kind of lumpy shaped stone. And you said, let's stop and check, see if we can, what is that? It's always, called my attention. And that, the answer that I got was that was a bit of stomach lining of a giant. Well, that rock is the size is bigger than you and I together.
It's like the Volkswagen Combi that we drive. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that size.
That size. And if that's just a bit of the stomach lining, it's difficult.
And I just need to add to that, because hopefully we might add some photographs to this. This is just a conversation, just to illustrate what we're talking about. But the beautiful thing about being in this part of the world, and I guess any part of the world, if they open their eyes, will probably start recognizing what we're talking about and recognizing and identifying the same kind of body parts and fossilized and petrified pieces of body parts and creatures and beings and so forth. But being here among the stone circles, millions of ancient ruins, we really are in the land where this has been preserved in ways where it probably hasn't been preserved like this anywhere else that I know of, because there's just so much of it. And once your eyes are open, you see it everywhere. So when I drive around now and I see random rocks lying around next to the road or halfway down a mountain and so forth, I don't see them as rocks anymore. I see them as a curiosity, as something out of place. And an oopart, what are they? I forget what it means now, but out of place, something objects or etc. So I start looking at any rock or any stone that's large enough to have been possibly a part of a body part of a large creature, individual, or a dinosaur, or a humanoid, or a giant. It just attracts my gaze immediately when I see these rocks scattered. And that rock that you're referring to on the way to Nelspruit, right next to the road, you can clearly see it was pushed there by the bulldozers when they were making that road, when they were building that road. And they were just pushed aside because it's too big to move. That probably weighs about 15 tons. and I can estimate that because I see these trucks that move around, these giant granite blocks on these huge flatbed trucks, and each one of those granite blocks that they cut down is normally 10 tons. And these huge flatbed trucks normally carry 2 of those blocks, sometimes just 1. So that's it. So you can see how big and heavy these rocks are, and that rock must be, I'd say it's probably between 10 and 20 tons. That's the size of it. And the interesting thing that caught my attention immediately was the folds. It has these folds. It's like literally as if you're looking at the folds of intestine or of the brain. Actually, what I first thought was it looks like the folds in a brain on a rock that's lying next to the road. And then you look at the geology around you, and this is where you have to be in touch and have to have prior knowledge and a foundation of knowledge and recognition of what the bedrock looks like. What does the sandstone look like? What does the quartz look like? What does the granite rocks that are around and the dolerite rocks that are around, what do they look like? And once you know the area and you're familiar with the geology of the area, then it's very easy to recognize the out of place rocks and parts and stones. And that one just is clearly so out of place. And that's why I kept driving that road for, probably a few years. And every time I drove past that weird looking rock, and there's another one next to it. They're actually 2 rocks right next to each other, And but that particular one, it looked like a piece of a brain, just on a scale. So that's why I wanted us to stop there. And I'm so glad that we did, because you connected with that being, the essence, the spirit of that being. And the information that you were given was that it was a piece of its stomach lining or intestine or something like that. I think you said stomach lining. And that makes sense, because if you look at the intestine and the folds in the intestine and the stomach lining, there are lots of folds and things like that. That's what happens in your stomach. It could be mistaken, especially once it's been fossilized or petrified, or a piece of brain. So that's just spectacular, that bit of information. And then, how big was that being? It was about 70 meters tall, or I forget how big it was.
By memory, I thought it was 110 is the number I seem to remember. 110 tall.
Okay.
Which again, and that isn't something that is just, it's not common in my brain to go, well, how big is 110 meters?
That's big. 110 meters is huge. That's a 40-story building.
Yeah. But it makes sense when to understand that scale of a being makes sense with the story that giant shared with me, which was about saying that they were put in a particular region, and they were the guardians and the caretakers of a particular region. So I
love the story. I must tell you, I love the story. I've got to tell you. So I'm so glad you brought it up and you're going to tell this, because this is one of my favorite stories. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. The reason I love the story is because one of the things that we read about the giants is that, and the stories in fairy tales, the giants, the giants used to eat humans, right? That's what we told all the time. The giants were bad giants. It's a Jack and the Beanstalk, and the giants lived in the clouds. They loved gold. They were obsessed with gold. They lived up there in the sky in the clouds, and they would come down and get gold from the earth and then go back up to the clouds. And you go, wow, isn't that the story of the Anunnaki? And then Jack and the Beanstalk, and he goes up and he meets the giants, and these giants were eating humans. These giants up in the sky were eating humans, so they were really bad. So whatever stories we are told about giants as we grow up in fairy tales, the giants are always bad and they eat people. So your story is completely the opposite.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Well, so it was a he, I believe, shared that he was the guardian and the caretaker of that particular region. So the beautiful thing was that you were there with me. So, you were asking questions and I was holding the frequency, which is what's way, way easier for me to explain to people, if they're tuning in, that I can find that frequency. So I can hold that frequency and start the conversation. But if I have to come up with the questions, then I have to leave that frequency, come to a conscious place in my head, come up with the question, then go back into that frequency. So it's much easier for me just to hang out there and other people to ask the questions. And I just, channel or interpret. So he was sharing that this was the area that he was looking after, and that if his job was to work with the earth, and if a particular plant or tree was running rampant and taking out, not balancing the vegetation, the giant would clear it. If something happened and the earth moved and a river got blocked, the giant could clear that. So the giant was, looking after this fledgling earth, which was much more malleable than it is in our time, and keeping things functioning, keeping things organized. And then there was this particular giant was hunted. So the part of the story that had this incredible emotion, and I still can remember the feeling of sadness as the giant shared this story with us of being hunted, brutally hunted for, their blood, their body parts by much smaller beings. But again, it's a scale issue in my brain to try to sort that out, because I think, all right, that these beings were in ships, they said, flying around them, surrounding them, isolating them, and then taking them down like a swarm of insects. But when you scale that up and you go, all right, if this is a 40-story creature and it's being surrounded by something in ships, the something in ships is more our scale, I'm guessing. So it was just extraordinary.
Yeah. So I'd like us to continue on that train of thought that you started now, because that's really important to expand on what these giants were doing, that they weren't nasty, horrible, man-eating giants. And this is probably before humans existed, long before humans existed.
Yep.
These were among the first beings that were on Earth, that were part of shaping the Earth and looking after the Earth, allowing the Earth to become the beautiful entity that it is, with a balanced ecosystem, the plants, the animals, and so forth. And these giants were put in place to look after the Earth and keep that balance. And as you described, these giants had a certain area to look after. So they were scattered around the world. Each one had a huge area. By comparison, it would be a large area, a few hundred square miles that they would look after. But there were a lot of these giants. It wasn't just one or two. There were thousands and thousands, thousands, maybe 100,000 of these giants on Earth. And This is why we find so many remains of giants. And this was just one particular giant. This must have been, I don't know where they came from, how they were created, who created them, how they arrived here. But they were a specific size. And I recall in our previous discussions that they were between 50 and 100 meters tall. Now, it sounds like a big difference, but if you think about in among humans, some people are almost twice as tall as other people, even among humanity. Some women are quite short, and so forth, or even some guys, and some people are very, very tall. So you get 6'8" guys, and then you get 4'8" people. So between 50 and 100 meters were the size of these giants. And then they were hunted and killed by these other malicious, bloodthirsty creatures and beings. And I remember that story that you first shared with me, and they were like swarms, and these little spaceships, or flying, they're not spaceships, they're flying craft that obviously worked on anti-gravity principles, because they could maneuver around like dragonflies around this giant and then take them down. So why don't you tell that story the way that you recall it?
So a couple of things I can share is in the taking them down, that was a story that came to us when we were at what you and I call the Energy Research Park bunch of circles. And there were all the stones at the top of that, as you start changing the way you look at rocks, you start to see body parts, you start to see shoulders, and that was like a horrible abattoir. And I remember talking to one of the giants there who explained the beauty of being hunted, and that they would swarm around, and what they would do is they would go into the nose and into the mouth, and they would suffocate the giant. So they would, fill those cavities, and then the giant would fall, and then they could sacrifice it. And I remember also when we were at the giant's footprint and talking about that surveyor whose footprint this is, And he explained that that particular species of giant, and as you said, there were different species of giants. They weren't all one. They weren't, yeah. That they were brought and hunted as well. And that what the Anunnaki knew was that when you find the remains of a giant, where the giant's blood has spilled, there will be gold. Yeah. So that area where the giant's footprint was this whole valley. And that they knew that there would be gold there. So that dates those caretaker giants well before the Anunnaki.
Yeah, yeah. And then look, what just came to mind is the whole other biblical story of Leviathan. Leviathan and what's the other creature? These giant creatures, the giant, is it bird and fish? Yeah. Or bird, like dragon-like bird creature, and then the giant fish that had this huge battle, but those were even bigger. I mean, those are like the size of half of Australia, and like the whole north of Africa, that whole stretch of the coast that borders on the Mediterranean Ocean was just one creature. So I mean, some of these oral stories go back, and in mythology, which are most likely true. That there were just these large creatures that were here in the beginning. What happened to them is when they die and they fall down, they become part of the landscape. And now that I understand the process of fossilization and petrification and how that happens, and how the body parts convert from organic matter to stone, from carbon-based matter to silicon-based matter. And we should have another session where we talk about that, because that's really important. I'll probably do a few lectures on that with slides to illustrate and demonstrate that. But that was really part of my own awakening and very rapid education, what fossilization and petrification actually means and how it happens. What are the chemical processes? What are the transformation, metamorphic processes, transformation, transmutation, etc.? How one thing can become, that's organic, that becomes silicon-based. And that's where, when you study chemistry, you study organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry. And now suddenly the one becomes the other. And yet when you're studying it at university, you say the two are completely separate. And so, oh, really? Well, they all come from the same source, but that's how they divide it in the physics and chemistry classes at university, organic and inorganic chemistry. So once you start studying what happens and the processes that happen in the petrification process, it becomes very easy to start understanding and comprehending the possibilities and the reality of such giant creatures that would have been here, that fell over and died for whatever reason it may have been, and then become part of the landscape. And then it's just too large for us to comprehend. So we don't even look for those clues in the landscapes around us on that grand scale, that a continent could actually have been a creature. Australia could have been a giant being that fell over there and then became what we now know Australia or New Zealand or Madagascar or parts of Africa. And yeah, we have to keep our minds open to all possibilities, because we know nothing. We are babies, ignorant and naive babies that are filled with arrogance and bloated egos, because we think we're clever because we went to university and we have a piece of paper that says that I now know this and I can do that. And that's unfortunately the undoing of our expansion of consciousness and illumination and so forth. So one of the great stories that I read several years ago, and I need to find it again, because it was one of those moments where you find something and you're so excited about it on the internet, and then something happens and you have to leave and your computer shuts down or whatever, and then it's gone. I can't find it again. And there have been a few of those occasions in my life, and it blows my mind. So I'm trying to avoid those happening again. And I found this beautiful creation story of some ancient civilization and culture. And this creation story says that in the beginning, after God created the heavens and the earth, he created the earth and he put 144 giants on earth, and these were very large giants. I'm thinking that these might be some of the giants that Enoch is talking about, about a mile high, 1.5 kilometers high. And there were 144 of these giants that were scattered over the earth, and the earth was just one giant sandpit. There was just sand and water. That's all it was. And these giants were put here, and they played in the sand. And they played in the sand like children would play on the beach, unconscious about what's happening around them, playing with the sand, pushing the sand together, letting the water flow through and playing with it. And they obviously weren't around for very long, these giants. And then after they finished playing, they died, they fell over and became part of the landscape. And that was just such an incredible story, because it was at the same time that I found that creation story, that the whole consciousness of mountains that look like fallen giants started to come out. And these amazing photographs that truly make you go, oh my God, that actually looks like a giant human being that fell over. You can see the head, you can see the shoulder, you can see a piece of the arm, you can see the eyes where the eyes should be. And there are many examples of giant mountains like this around the world. It's just not just one or two, there's many of them. Just like we have incredible examples of giant trees, right? And that is a comparison, that's a parallel. So it seems to me that at the time that we had these huge giants on Earth, we also may have had these very, very large giant trees that were like 10 miles high, maybe even taller. And that those trees were also chopped down. And now we think they are mountains, while in essence, they were actually ancient giant trees. So there's a comparison and a parallel between the giant trees, the giant fungus. Oh, by the way, and the fungus and the mushrooms and those kind of giant plants, there's plenty of fossil evidence. So, our paleontologists and whatever you call the people that work with fossilized plants and all that, they are very happy to acknowledge that these were these giant mushrooms, and they were 10 meters tall, and there were all these and other types of plants, of fossilized and petrified plants of that nature, and petrified trees and petrified forests. But the moment you start talking about giant trees, then they go, no, that's not possible. And it shows you there's like selective acceptance of what history could look like. And no, that we can't accept that. We'll accept giant mushrooms that are 10 meters tall, but not giant trees that are 10 miles tall. That's not going to happen.
Well, it's one of the that I love about shamanism in my tradition is that I often say that religion is your faith in someone else's reality and someone else's story, and shamanism is my faith in my direct experience. So when I contact a rock and I am now talking to a giant, that's my direct experience. And I've done this for 33 years now, so I kind of know the difference between what's something talking to me and what's me talking to me. But it's the direct experience, and you have to have your mind open enough to be able to accept what you're hearing without filtering it. You can't filter it. I remember so many of the conversations that I've had with people where I can go so far, but if it's not something that I know and there's no vocabulary that I have, the entity that we're talking to has to say, well, I'm sorry, but can you just ask John Paul yes or no questions, because he doesn't have the language to say this. And I think that's a beautiful thing to say, that I have to be open enough to accept what I'm hearing without filtering or without trying to force it into a paradigm that I have.
Yes. And there's often, I recall when you have been present with us and in our groups, or just you and I, going around and connecting, whether it's the stone circle ruins or fossilized body parts or other things. Often the questions that we ask are irrelevant, or the being that we're talking, that you've connected to, doesn't understand the question, because that being has that essence or that energy that you're talking to has no reference of what you're talking about. Like, did you have cars when you were around? They wouldn't understand what the word car means. Yeah. So they can't answer. Did you have cars? Yes or no? They can't answer that either with a yes or a no because they don't know what a car is. So it's really difficult when you start communicating spiritually and shamanically with these beings and their energies, because there's a disconnect of language, and it's really interesting. That in itself is an interesting process. You start to learn how to phrase the questions and what would be understandable, comprehensible to an entity or a being from a different time, at a different place, different perspective. So how are you? How was your day?
Day. A day? What? Yeah, day?
Day. What is day? What is a day? So it's a fascinating subject, and people that haven't had this experience I really hope and wish that they do experience this at some stage, to realize how exciting this journey is. If you open yourself up to this knowledge and believe that anything is possible, because ultimately everything is magic, because everything comes from manifestation, and magic because it's manifested into reality through the source code of vibration, resonance, and frequency. And when you combine sound and light, you manifest matter. And so everything around us is actually magic, brought together by magic. And isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that movies like Harry Potter and movies and TV shows that deal with magic are so popular? They are the most popular shows, and with the mythological stories about giants, about all kinds of mythology, because people somehow in their genetic memory resonate with the information that it's a lot closer to the truth than we are led to believe by the current social economic system and our education system on earth. We know inside that the history is very different from what we've been told and lied about. And that is just a great, I believe, a point of arrival. That was for me specifically very important for me.
Yep. There's two things that I'm trying to remember that we touched on. One was the idea that the giants have shared with me that they came at the request of Gaia. So the request of the planet, of Earth, they came. And they came to do this job. And they said that what they loved to do was to help maintain these balances and look after these territories, and that they were absolutely brought here because that's their job and they love to do it and they were happy to do it. And that there was a sense of purpose to them. And there's just a beautiful, the energy when I'm talking to those particular old giants is just an incredible sense of satisfaction and ease and peace. It's just incredible. There's nothing that's aggressive. They're just sitting and watching, and they're waiting for something to happen. And then, okay, I'll fix that, and they just are at peace. But I guess that's also that sense of size. Nothing goes very quickly at that size. So
right. And yet when you're that size, you can move around very quickly from one place to another.
Yeah.
Think about it. If you're a mile-high giant, every step you take is half a mile. Right?
You can cover territory.
You can cover 1,000 miles with 2,000 steps.
Yeah.
How quickly will it take you to walk 2,000 steps? I don't know, 20 minutes. So you can walk 1,000 miles in 20 minutes, half an hour, an hour. So if you're 1.5 kilometers or a mile high, you can cover the whole earth in a day if you want to.
Yep. One of the other challenges was to understand a lot of the time when we were talking to different people and they were asking questions, there was a mindset that if you're a human-shaped thing, you must be a social creature. And these giants weren't. They were very solitary and they were very happy to be solid. They didn't need each other. They didn't need large community. They didn't have family groups. But, that's our paradigm, is that if you're kind of like me in shape, even though you're huge, you must also have a wife and kids, and not the same.
No. No, that's a very important point. So the purpose of these giants in ancient times was very different from what we see our purpose as, and family and all this, family values and so forth, because that's a whole different subject again, where we come from, how we were created, and what our role and purpose on earth is, and that was, we were created as slaves for the gold mines. So it's a completely different paradigm, different time, different epoch, different reason why we're here. These giants were probably sexless. I don't know. Maybe they were male and some female. I don't understand why that would be the case if they didn't procreate. So I assume immediately that they would be genderless because they didn't procreate. They were just here. And again, we can go into the subject, how they were formed and how they were created and how they could have existed if Gaia called them. How does that happen? And once again, I'd remind those that are watching this, once you embrace and get to the essence of sound, resonance, and frequency as a source of all creation, everything from the smallest subatomic particles to electrons, to atoms, to everything, to all the molecules, to the Earth, to the solar system, to galaxies, and that how everything manifests in toroidal fields and the energies that are behind everything. Once you embrace that knowing, and that is driven by consciousness, which is a frequency, it's a thought. That consciousness exists in an aphysical form, which I often refer to as the source code, or God, the brain of God, or the mind of God. That brings forth the universe and everything in it. It comes from some level of consciousness that brings it forth. It's not a random, infinite number of particles bumping into each other and bringing forth this. That is, unfortunately, the lies of mainstream physics and science, to take us away from creation, take us away from the magic of creation, taking us away from this incredible story that we are part of, everything in creation, the infinity of creation. And it all comes from thought, from consciousness, from manifesting your thoughts. So if Gaia is a manifestation, just like everything else in the universe around us is a manifestation of that primordial divine creative spirit that brought forth the earth and all the beautiful things on her. And Gaia needs a being or a group of beings to look after different parts of Gaia. That's a frequency, that's a thought, that's a source code that comes from Gaia, that resonates through Gaia and will manifest that being or that creature as an important part of Gaia's cleansing and protection mechanism. It's just a thought and a resonance frequency that could have given birth to these so-called giants, as we refer to them. Giant compared to us, to them, they were normal. But these were beings that were looking after Earth, created by Earth itself. Is that how they came to be? I don't know, because I can't imagine how else the giants would have arrived on Earth. So as you were talking, I was formulating this image of how the giants manifested through Gaia's own needs. I know that that's a far stretch for a lot of people, but if you watch my other lectures and videos on the laws of nature and sound, resonance, and frequency, you might get a better insight into what I'm talking about here, and how really we as conscious beings who have been separated from our abilities of magic and thought projection and thought creation. We should be able to manifest everything with our thoughts, but that has been shut off, so we can't do that. So we just remain dumb, stupid, ignorant slaves to the global elite right now, and the slaves are rising up. They're becoming more conscious. They're becoming wiser. That's why they have to constantly shut us down, like the story of Tower of Babel. We better go down and shut them down, because if they can do this, they can become like us. They become conscious, they can manifest, they can do magic, and then we're in big trouble because they'll no longer think that we're gods, and they'll rebel against us.
Well, one of the stories that I have been adding pieces to for 30 years is at the very, very beginning of my shaman journey, I had this understanding that Gaia was this consciousness that wanted to see what would happen if we created a world that was based on unconditional love, so that plants could come, animals could come, and that this being, this planet, this space would just keep giving. So it would absorb, transmute, and give again. absorb, transmute, and give again. And what would happen if we did that? So the pieces I get to understand over time is that other consciousnesses would say, oh, we like that project. We like that unconditional love project. That sounds pretty cool. So that's how the Earth gets populated, Gaia gets populated with all the incredible different species, because everyone says, well, let's give that a go. That sounds pretty groovy, that there would be this place of unconditional love and acceptance, and we'll keep trying things out. So the giants fit in because if everything can come, if everything is welcome to give it a go, this is the place where you can give it a go, unconditional love will work, let's have it at, then you need help because something's going to get out of control. Yeah. And if everything can work here, then something has to kind of help maintain a balance. Otherwise, we end up with something overrunning the planet. So then you look at our science and you go, well, there's a couple instances where that's been the case. So I get, pieces of this understanding of what it means that there's a consciousness in things. And it's really interesting to have this last couple of years where I'm now talking to the consciousness of dolerite. It's like, what? I'm talking to who? And they're explaining, yeah, this is how this was. And we came here and we helped set up this planet. We helped with the minerals, but it was such a beautiful place that we decided we wanted to stay. So we took a mineral form. Our consciousness took a mineral form so we could stay here. And you hear those kinds of stories and you start to really change your understanding of how consciousness and manifestation works, how things evolve and grow, and timelines. It's just been incredible.
You brought me to a wonderful statement that I want to share with you, and a vision, and possibly to end this discussion, because we've been going for just more than an hour now, I think. One of Max Planck's famous statements. Max Planck, one of the fathers of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and the guy that discovered the quantum leap. The Max Planck, the guy that coined the phrase, the matrix, he was an incredible guy. But the most important thing that most people aren't aware of, because that's a part of mainstream science and physics, they don't want to share that part about Max Planck and the people in those days, because many of them were really conscious. They were really spiritual and very conscious beings, or they were discovering this weird world, smaller than the atom. The quantum mechanics cowboys. And Max Planck, his famous statement is, consciousness is fundamental. Nothing gets beyond consciousness. Everything comes from consciousness. All the matter, everything that he was studying, all the subatomic particles and quantum mechanics comes from consciousness. That is really important for people to know, that even people like that, Max Planck, believe that the source of everything was an ever-pervasive field of consciousness, the primordial field of consciousness out of which all of creation comes.
Gorgeous. Gorgeous.
All right, well, I think we've sort of covered the subject of giants and all the ancillary channels that lead to the giants, including manifestation and how the giants are hunted.
There's a bit of, I think I would love to, in a chat, talk about the giants that the Anunnaki enlisted to help with operations. And let's talk a little bit about their role and how that all ended, because that connects to the work with the giants at KZN.
Right. Yes, that's KwaZulu-Natal.
Yep. So I think that would be an interesting, to add some of that information about that role.
Okay, and I think so. Let's do that in our next session. I just also like to add and finish a very important part, which we didn't really, which we touched upon it, but we didn't explain it. That is, these giants that were put in place different parts of the world as custodians of that part of the world, and those giants were being hunted by these smaller beings, these malicious, bloodthirsty, flesh-eating beings, whoever they were. I think they may have been the Kingu races, these bloodthirsty, draconian That's just a thought. That's something that resonates with me. They had advanced technology, levitation, spacecraft, and so forth. And these guys were possibly hunting these giants. And you mentioned before that once they saw the giant, that giant was it. They would hunt it until they got it. But it was converse as well. The giants knew that these guys were dangerous, so they would sneak up on them and then smack their craft out of the sky and kill them and get rid of them, because they knew these smaller creatures in their weird flying craft, like dragonflies, would kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why throughout Southern Africa and other parts of the world, you find these remains, these petrified, fossilized remains of giants scattered on the mountains and across the world in different parts. Suddenly you just see a bunch of rocks together that make no sense. They're completely out of place in that geology, because that was where one of these giants fell and then eventually turned to stone. So once they were killed by these smaller creatures in their flying craft, the giant would fall, they would be processed, cut up, and used for whatever they wanted to use them for. And then they would leave the remains of that giant lying there. And then with time and with the flood and water and mud, that giant, the remains of that giant would then turn to stone. And that's why we find these weird groups of rocks that make no sense. These are all fossilized, petrified body parts of these giants scattered right across the world. That is, to me, that was a huge sense of relief, because I couldn't understand why we find some giants here, bones, and then over there we got another cluster of bones that is a giant. So when you shared this story about these giants scattered across the world, and they were protecting their little Garden of Eden on Earth, and that's where they were hunted and fell, that makes so much sense. And we can put that into the library of fossilized giants all over the world.
Yep. So definitely we need to go into all of the fossils that you're finding. I think the next chat will be the fossils. Yeah. Let's take everyone into the fossils of all these parts.
Yeah. All right. Well, until we chat again,
Okay.
bye for now.
Bye for now.